Un bref communiqué d'agence nous apprenait hier que Robert Capa, le plus connu des photographes de guerre américains, bien que hongrois de naissance, venait de trouver la mort en sautant sur une mine près de Fully, dans la région de Taiping, au sud d'Hanoï, alors qu'il effectuait pour un équipage.
That was Robert Capa. You knew him, didn't you? Yes, you did. No matter how old you might be. For one thing, if nothing else, Omaha Beach. The 5th of June 1944, England. Just before going aboard a transport ship, he too, like all soldiers heading off to war, wrote a farewell letter to his family and hid it away in his shirt pocket. But he wasn't a soldier, of course. That's the reason why you know Robert Capa, but not the thousands of anonymous faces he photographed over the years. There was no pressure on him to volunteer, yet he was the only reporter and photographer to take part in the first wave of landings on Omaha Beach. He latched onto the 2nd Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment, because at the time they were meant to reach the Normandy coast, 6:30 a.m. exactly, he knew there'd be enough light to take photographs. Even if you've never seen the photos Robert Capa took that day, you knew they existed. You knew that someone had been mad enough to join the front ranks of that armada, with his cameras protected by waterproof waxed canvas bags.
Almighty God, we commend to thy overruling providence the men and women of our forces by sea, by land and in the air, beseeching thee to take into thine own hands both them and the cause they serve. Be thou their strength when they are set in the midst of so many and great dangers, and grant that whether by life or by death, they may win for the whole world the fruits of their sacrifice and a just peace.
But don't go imagining that he was a stranger to fear. On the contrary, on more than one occasion, it had him in his grip, shaking his whole body, deforming his face, and twisting his insides. On more than one occasion, against all the evidence of the crazy risks he ran, he would say, "I'm a coward." But never was the fear as strong as his desire to dance with death. Suicidal then? Hardly. He loved life too much, women, gambling, alcohol. But he could only enjoy it when edging as close as possible to danger. Remember those 4 words, as close as possible. He stayed on Omaha Beach for an hour and a half, the time it took to finish off all his films. Getting the photos of the landing to the New York Office of Life was the responsibility of John Morris, who remembered Capa at the beginning of this film. Out of all the photos Capa risked his life to take that day, only 11 would be saved. But you won't be seeing those 11 photographs in this film. In fact, you'll see practically none of the 75,000 photos he took throughout his life. To put it bluntly, we were told no. Lawyers' letters, the threat of legal action even intimidated witnesses refusing to speak to us. The Capa legend is under lock and key. After Capa's death, his brother Cornell became obsessed with protecting the body of work he had inherited. Even though the work had always been intended to be seen, he decided to lock it out of sight, severely restricting access. Around Capa, a clan had grown up, the Magnum Agency. The copyright protection is pitiless. But what exactly must the curious be protected from? It all began with this photo of a man dying in Spain during the first of Capa's 5 wars. When Capa left for Barcelona on the 5th of April 1936 as a special correspondent for the magazine Vue, he knew what was at stake. As the journalist Martha Gellhorn wrote, at the time, Spain was the one place in the world where free men could fight Hitler and his imitators. After being briefly tempted by written journalism, Capa turned to photography, purely by chance. The man who would become one of the 20th century's greatest photographers had no predisposition for photography, let alone a vocation. This woman had a lot to do with it. Apparently she means nothing to you. And yet, if there's one name that really must be mentioned in connection with Robert Capa's life, it's Gerda Taro. In 1933, just as Hitler came to power, she was a member of the German Communist Party and had to go into exile to avoid ending up in a concentration camp. Capa would never love any other woman the way he loved Gerda. He taught her how to wield a Leica, developed her first photos for her, but he always called her the boss, being fully aware of the power she held over him. To a significant extent, Gerda invented Capa. Physically, first of all. When they first met in Paris, Capa looked like a tramp. With Gerda in charge, he underwent a transformation. With his nails manicured, shoes cleaned, hair trimmed, a close shave, suit and tie, and soft hat, he looked the part of the authentic American reporter, something he wasn't. To sell his photos at a better price, he and Gerda invented a fictitious American photographer and called him Bob Capa. Bob Capa. The name had an authentic ring to it, and the photo agencies fell for it. For it's time you were told, before he met Gerda, he wasn't Robert Capa at all, but Endre Friedmann. Endre Friedmann's photos were often badly centered and blurred, but they captured the feel of the era. He became one of the principal witnesses of the Front Populaire movement. He had an undeniable ability for empathizing with the subjects of his photographs. Affable and relaxed, he didn't have to try hard to like people, to depict their everyday lives and struggles. His photographs appealed to the left-wing press. They were simple and direct, with a strong focus on faces. He made the people look dignified without idealizing them. In fact, Endre Friedmann was very similar to the men and women he photographed. No hero of legend, just a decent chap trying to keep on the right side of the barricade without blowing his own trumpet about it. The day Capa entered his life, things became more complicated. Endre Friedmann ended up getting a raw deal. He, the Hungarian immigrant, the stateless Jew, the left-wing Berliner, the brother of the Spanish Republicans who filled his heart with such emotion, decided to really turn into the fictitious American who was no more than his shadow. But did he really want to become a respectable bourgeois? Well, yes and no. More no than yes, but yes all the same. And maybe it's this that the very influential Magnum agency, custodian of a story it's unable to contain, wants nothing to do with. On the 19th of August 1936, at Barcelona railway station, Capa accompanied Republican fighters as they headed off to war. A cameraman next to him filmed the scene. Watch carefully. What you're seeing here on your screen, the crowd, the couple kissing, is exactly what Capa saw that day through his own camera lens. Cerro Moriano was Capa's baptism of fire. Scanning the sky, he wondered what unlucky star he was under. Franco's planes had a marked preference for civilian targets over military ones. Capa photographed what the readers of American and European newspapers had never been shown before. The true desolation of war, the raw, blood-spattered horror of it all. The martyred children he met along the roadsides reminded him of his own childhood, spent on the streets of Budapest with gangs of urchins living by their wits. Uneducated, undisciplined, a scrapper. He too, when barely older than these children, had fled fascism, leaving his native Hungary for Berlin, then Paris.
Aviación! Aviación!
Aviación!
The physical courage of Capa and Gerda amazed everyone. They refused to take shelter from enemy fire, nonchalantly taking their photographs while all around them soldiers were being mowed down by machine gun fire. Capa and Gerda were torn between their aversion to Francoist barbarity and the heady, liberating feeling the fighting produced in them. Death was all around them, of course, claiming civilians and Republican fighters alike. Their own death, too, could be glimpsed behind every victim. But beyond the suffering and pain of the Spanish people, the very foundations of the bourgeois order were trembling, and Capa and Gerda were there to photograph its ruins. It was on an afternoon very like this one that Capa joined the Republican forces in a trench at the front, and on the 5th of September 1937 took the most famous photograph of the Spanish Civil War. He sent the film and many others to Paris, making no mention of its importance. He clearly had no inkling that several months later he'd be a famous photographer, simply because, as he ironically commented, the camera I was holding above my head photographed a man at the moment he was shot. Life magazine ran the photo with the caption, "Robert Capa's camera catches a Spanish soldier the instant he is hit by a bullet in the head." The Americans had never seen anything like this. Some protested, but everyone was shocked. And yet, for the last 30 years at least, there's been doubt about the photo. Could it have been staged? Supporting this theory are factors such as the absence of a negative, Capa's own contradictory versions of the incident, and the fact that the dead soldier has never been satisfactorily identified. What's more, there wasn't just one, but two Republican soldiers photographed by Capa as they were shot. Two snapshots of death, both from a similar angle, the same day, at the same time, in the same place, with the enemy firing the whole time at the photographer's back. It's hard not to conclude that it was posed. By superposing the photos, simply replacing the first soldier with the second, it becomes clear that the stubble on the field has remained upright, that the sky is the same, almost to the last cloud, and that the first dead soldier disappeared into the wings, as it were, to make room for a second actor playing the same role. A former combatant of the Spanish Civil War gave a detailed description of the way in which Capa and Gerda would sometimes stage false attacks. He wrote in his diary, "One day, they organized a big imaginary attack. A false fascist position was overrun by soldiers, uttering blood-curdling screams and seemingly taking great pleasure in the combat, leaping for joy after their victory. Capa was very proud of the result. War staged and posed. Surprised? But there's nothing that astonishing about it. Just watch the newsreels of that time. They're all alike. Perfect composition, cinematic lighting, filmed with a true aesthetic sense. The soldier elegantly enters the shot and carefully takes aim for the camera. The cameraman doesn't shake. No one's in a hurry. It's a reconstruction after the event for the viewer's benefit. But let us not delve any further into this trickery. Capa went to Spain to photograph the people's victory over fascism. What he actually covered there was something totally different, which could only incite heated feelings and controversy. The picture of the Republican being killed was a photograph of the impossible, of that elusive moment when life and death meet. Death right there, lurking underneath life. It's a vision of that moment which preys on the imagination of every human being. The bursting of the bubble, the brutal lancing of this swelling we call life. Real or faked, Capa's photograph is the one which all photographers, whether they admit it or not, dream of taking. Reality stripped bare, naked death. The Spanish are right to consider it a universal icon, in the same way as Picasso's Guernica. When the rest of the world turned selfishly away and let Spain fall, Capa was there to watch her fight, to watch her mourn. He photographed her battles, her ruins, and his love for her was always true. On the 27th of July 1937, Capa, who had temporarily returned to Paris, learnt that Gerda had been crushed to death by a tank. Early in March, more in love than ever and now becoming jealous too, Capa had proposed, but she had turned him down. The Pequeña Rubena, the little redhead, had finally decided to sign her own photos, which more often than not she had attributed to Capa. She was just starting to gain a reputation for herself. The press hailed the first woman photographer to be killed while doing her job, and left-wing papers the world over made her a heroine of the anti-fascist struggle. When she was buried, she was only 26. Gerda's death plunged Capa into despair. He locked himself away, refused to see his friends, hardly ate but drank a lot. He felt guilty. It was he who had introduced Gerda to both photography and Spain. Henri Cartier-Bresson described him as a man living under a veil, disillusioned, cynical, and determined never to love again. But Capa went to war again. Back to Spain first of all, and then to China in 1938 to cover the Japanese aggression there. It was part of a project which also included a documentary by Joris Ivans. In the Far East, the Second World War had already got underway, and from as early as 1937. It was a war like the one he had known in Spain, a people fighting for their freedom. That year, Capa had been named Photographer of the Year by Picture Post magazine. In Hollywood, Clark Gable was making Too Hot to Handle, a film, rumor had it, based on Capa's exploits in China, even though at the time the film was being shot, Capa hadn't even arrived. His legend was taking care of itself. The same fear as in Madrid and Toledo, the same planes, the same worried glances at the sky, the same mothers, the same children. And from the invasion of Manchuria to the horror of the Japanese rape of Nanking, the same indifference from the Society of Nations. The Japanese knowingly bombed civilian areas. Capa knew from bitter experience that after the panicked running through the streets, after the bustling and screaming, would come a time of ash and bodies. In Paris, the Hungarian writer György Markos saw the photos sent by Capa. It seemed to him that Capa had decided to show the world atrocities of the kind which had brought about Gerda's death. His photographs of the Chinese-Japanese War were among some of the most harrowing he had ever taken. Children with bloated stomachs, pregnant mothers covered in blood, the Chinese forced to dig their own graves while Japanese soldiers watched. Chinese civilians used by Japanese soldiers for live bayonet practice. Capa had gone to China in search of his own death, Marcus concluded. But for the moment at least, he failed. Capa returned to France in more despair than when he'd left. He soon left again for Spain, where the Republican forces were being defeated. The year was 1939. Capa photographed the last battles, taking such risks, dancing so close to death, that his pictures left readers stunned. For Picture Post, he was now no less than the greatest war photographer in the world. Endre Friedmann wept as his war of passion went through its death throes. 300,000 had died, half of them civilians. Franco would imprison 300,000 political prisoners and execute thousands more. In March 1939, Capa photographed the end of the Spanish dream, with fighters going into exile at the French border. Capa was born to be Parisian, said the writer Erwin Shaw. Urbane, elegant, languid, and a dandy when the fancy took him. But what could a war photographer do during peacetime, apart from waste his time? Thus he spent his nights drinking in bars and playing poker, occupations he thought of as the human art of self-destruction. He was always broke, money burning a hole not only in his pockets, but in everyone else's too. He hadn't stopped taking photographs altogether, of course. He would snap children here, workers there, even the Tour de France. But Capa thought of himself not simply as a photographer, more as an adventurer, and he missed the danger. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. In Paris, the reservists were called up. Since he was not yet being sent to cover this new war, he was forced into exile once again. In the 1950s, McCarthy's America would make him suffer for his left-wing involvement. But for now, with the air in Europe becoming unbreathable, the country welcomed him. Capa thought of his mother, who had pampered him as a child, dressing him in a sailor's outfit. Did she ever suspect that during his student days in Berlin, he had at times been so hungry he had stolen food from his landlady's dog? Capa thought about Hungary and about the Germany he had known for a short while and loved, the Germany of Bertolt Brecht, Fritz Lang and Lubitsch. He had a dark foreboding about the horror of the years to come, but how could he have suspected that only 5% of Hungarian Jews would survive the genocide? Capa had dreamt of being an American and would become one after the war. But in reality, Friedmann hated this country, which to him seemed soulless. In fact, he never really found his place in it. Just as when playing poker in New York and holding only a pair of jacks against a pile of aces, he would say in his heavily accented English, "I am not happy." As the 1940s got underway, he was working in the United States. But he was bored, feeling the whole time that he was being kept from the war in Europe. On the 10th of May 1940, the Germans marched into France. Capa felt a growing nostalgia for Europe. After covering the London Blitz during the summer of 1940, he was living from hand to mouth when, through Life magazine, he got back in touch with Ernest Hemingway, whom he had known in Spain. Finally, in May 1942, the war finally reached out to Capa. He was 29, and the United States had just entered the conflict. When Capa arrived in London, the intensive German bombing raids had stopped. Had unfortunately stopped, he thought with shame, as he did each time he hoped for the worst, so that he could photograph it. It was a painful paradox. He detested war, yet missed it when it wasn't there. No bombing raids, no victims, no ruins, no good photos. It would be a long wait, and with no official press pass, the fighting would go on without him. As always, he found consolation in women. They, at least, like alcohol and gambling, seemed to be present in an ever-abundant supply. With his dashing gypsy manner, always sniffing for life, he could seduce any woman. And he had no prejudice about size, color, background, religion, nationality, or marital status. Vivian Leigh, Hedy Lamarr, Pinky or Graziella, Churchill's daughter-in-law, Pamela, Toni Sorrell, actresses, models, journalists, students, secretaries, or countesses. Capa was adored by women. He was the sort of man one boasts of having known, one is proud to be seen with, and about whom one invents stories for the simple pleasure of being able to tell them. In spring 1943, at last he leapt on the 7:30 train for Glasgow, and from there onto a ship transporting troops to North Africa. His third war was waiting. North Africa, Egypt, Libya. Capa would not photograph the legendary battles of North Africa, but he was at least back at the heart of some extremely violent military operations. For 3 days, barely sleeping, under heavy shelling, he photographed the Battle of El Guetar. He was back in the midst of danger, soaking it up, inhaling it. And yet he wasn't satisfied, feeling that none of his photos matched up to the one of the Spanish Republican. It was an obsession which haunted him. He knew that he was identified with that one photo, which he would spend his whole life chasing, but never find again. The Allied landings in Italy launched him on a crazed 3-week hunt for Germans, and he didn't come up lacking. Each time he found himself at the heart of the action, he proved his efficiency, always remaining faithful to his watchword. If your photos aren't good enough, you didn't get close enough. In his memoirs, Capa never spoke about all the carnage he had witnessed. His photos spoke for him. On the 2nd of October 1943, he walked into a school smelling of flowers and death. He discovered the bodies of 20 or so children, their little feet poking out from their coffins. Children, noted Capa, who were old enough to fight the Germans and be killed by them, and just a little bit too big to fit into children's coffins. But this time, unlike during the war in Spain, which was still very much on his mind, Capa, although depressed and exhausted, was on the winner's side. In a few months, they would be landing in France. June 1944.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've all heard the great news of our invasion, which is going, we're sure, to lead us on to victory. And while wishing good luck and Godspeed to all of our forces, especially perhaps our own loved ones, let's get back to work just as soon as we possibly can, redouble our efforts to bring these boys back victoriously and just as speedily as possible.
D-Day was Tuesday, the 6th of June, 1944. I went to the office knowing that it would be a long wait, and we waited indeed all day Tuesday. We all knew that Capa would be with the first wave of infantry, and we were terribly worried. Finally, Wednesday evening, a motorcyclist came to the London office of Life with a small packet of films. So I told the darkroom crew to rush, and make contact prints as fast as possible. I had to have contact prints for editing. And a few minutes later, a young man came rushing into my office, and he was crying, and he said, "John, the films are all ruined." I turned the heat on in the drying cabinet, and the emulsion ran. And he said, "You can't see anything." So I ran back to the darkroom with him, and I held up the films one at a time. And the first 3, there was nothing. It was just pea soup. But on the 4th roll of 35 millimeter, I found 11 images that could be printed. And those are the pictures that made history.
The photos of the century, which Capa ventured into hell to take, and which sealed his fate. On Omaha Beach, before getting back onto a boat with the wounded, Robert Capa thought about what a wounded young airman had once shouted at him as he was photographing his dead comrades. Vulture. Vulture. Isn't this what many other bloody fighters had thought of him in Spain, China, or North Africa? Of course, they'd often been pleased to have a war photographer at their sides, someone to testify before posterity to their bravery. But when they were lying there bloody and broken, the thought could not be avoided that Capa's celebrity was won at the price of their suffering. His most beautiful photographs, the ones that made the front pages, were smeared with their blood. After D-Day, for 48 hours, Capa was believed to be dead. An American sergeant had reported seeing his body floating in the sea, and the army put out an obituary notice. But on the beach, amidst the soldiers, this rare piece of film shows that he was very much alive and taking photographs.
C'est difficile, mais je crois que c'est Capa. Je crois. C'est formidable. C'est la première fois que j'ai vu ça.
Robert Capa, filmed by a war reporter. Capa was now accompanying the 82nd Airborne Division as it advanced. Once more, he found himself near the cameraman. What you're seeing here is exactly what he was seeing, and from the same angle. This is the raw reality, just before he decides to photograph it, just before, for example, he decides to capture this wounded soldier being carried on a wheelbarrow, a snapshot of war. The Allied conquest of Normandy was very hard on the civilian population. Among the ruins, the GIs sometimes look like vulnerable children on whom a monstrous trick has been played, thrusting a gun in their hands and sending them into another world. From town to town, Capa lingered on the faces of the German prisoners, searching deep in their eyes for repentance, but finding only indifference or fear. Did these haggard, defeated soldiers with arms raised to the sky know that this Jewish photographer, cosmopolitan and revolutionary, represented everything they hated and wanted to destroy? On the 25th of August 1944, Capa was in the jeep following General Leclerc towards Paris. A woman held out a baby to him, which he kissed, unable to hold back the tears. John Morris would describe his photographs of the liberation of the capital as somewhat disappointing. He didn't seek out sophisticated angles. He wasn't fluid enough in the way he approached his subject. He took most of them from head height. They were too obvious. You could easily see what he was thinking. Capa didn't care. These were probably the happiest days of his life. Since he was 17, he had wandered from hotel to hotel, from battlefield to battlefield. Stateless since 1931, he was still using his old refugee passport. He'd spent his life wandering the world, never taking root. But on this day, the 25th of August 1944, he finally felt he had come home. With liberation, Paris was freeing him for a short time from his old demons, his loneliness, his wanderings. He understood. It was for him too that these men had fought and died. In 1945, the Second World War was drawing to a close. Capa reflected with irony on his coming unemployment, that moment when he would have to put an end to his perpetual dodging of bullets. One night, as a challenge, he set out to seduce the legendary Ingrid Bergman, whose photo many GIs carried in their packs. A year previously, Ingrid Bergman had won an Oscar for her role in Gaslight, and she was quickly becoming the biggest star in Hollywood. In Paris, she fell in love with Capa, who from the very start of their affair confessed to her how death was a constant feature of his dreams. In early September, Ingrid Bergman went back to the United States to continue her role as the pure and virginal young girl, and Capa, totally at a loss as to how to occupy himself during peacetime, soon went to join her.
You don't love me.
Hello? Palace Hotel?
You haven't said anything.
Why not become a writer, director, or producer? Ingrid Bergman was delighted. But after only a few weeks, Capa had made up his mind about Hollywood, declaring it the biggest mess of shit I ever stepped in. The end of his one-night stand with the film industry, the end of his romantic interlude with Ingrid Bergman. Endre Friedmann clearly wasn't cut out for the United States. For years now, he'd more or less been hiding behind the persona of Robert Capa, and as incredible as it might seem now, almost all his admirers knew nothing of his true identity. When his true history was finally revealed in 1947, did he feel like lying again? Capa doesn't exist. There's nothing real about him. From head to foot, he's a complete invention, he confessed to a friend. The young life photographer Myron Davis recalled how Capa would stay locked in the bathroom for hours on end. Every morning, he spent an inordinate amount of time putting on his character. Davis immortalized this long and painful morning ritual, which according to him was indispensable for Friedmann to turn into Capa. The man who invented himself would be a good way to describe Capa. Although it might be more exact to say, the man who had to reinvent himself again every morning. Since the end of the war, Capa hadn't shown much ambition, but one project was dear to his heart: the creation of Magnum, a new agency comprising young photographers who would be masters of their own work. The idea had first come to him when he discovered one of his own photos, bought unbeknownst to him by a neo-Nazi newspaper, illustrating an anti-Semitic article. Magazine editors, at first unable to believe Magnum's audacity in claiming ownership of both photographs and negatives, something unheard of before then, ended up by accepting these new rules, providing Capa with an unexpected income. At the start of May 1948, Capa got some good news at last. The first for a long time. The state of Israel would soon see the light of day. In his euphoria, he set off for Tel Aviv, where he covered his fourth conflict. The Israeli War of Independence would be the one Capa most related to. He photographed it with passion, rediscovering his legendary eye for a photo and efficacy, and pulling off one of the greatest set of photos of his career. The arrival of the Holocaust survivors, the return of the ashes of 200,000 Jews murdered in the Nazi concentration camps, men and women speechless at finding themselves praying for their dead near the tombs of the ancient Hebrew kings. Never before had Capa felt so close to those he was photographing. Never before had he captured with such intensity people's suffering and hope. How would Friedmann have summed up his long life spent with Robert Capa? At the beginning of the 1950s, the name was still that of a living legend. He had many friends. His love affairs were as exciting as ever. He rubbed shoulders with Picasso and Matisse, as he had previously with Hemingway and Steinbeck. There was no shortage of work. All the same, everyone from that time describes him as a man who had lost his way, who had had enough, who no longer believed his own lies. Eva Besniaud, who had been Friedmann's friend longer than anyone, described him as having become a shallow, pitiful ham, blowing the jackpot from Magnum on the horses and continually scrounging off his nearest and dearest, only to lose it all. Erwin Shaw described him as the man who had seen too much, as a desperate, defeated man full of regrets, whose camera has seen so much death and grief, and as he who bears the stigmata of all the tragedies and suffering he has witnessed. Playing the role of Capa was exhausting. Capa felt trapped by his image. So it was that he decided to go one last time, the fifth time, one time too many. While in Japan, he agreed to go to Indochina to replace a colleague who had to return to the States for personal reasons. He knew very well that with each new war, his chances of survival diminished. In Israel, he had felt death come closer than ever before. It's probably the reason he didn't go to Korea, or hadn't gone to Indochina earlier, preferring to take the risk of no longer being considered the world's greatest war photographer.
Ça, c'est à Indochine, quelques jours avant sa mort.
Why did he agree this time? Did he need the money? Did he want to bolster his reputation? Or was it simply that he had nothing to lose?
Non, ça c'est Bob. Ça c'est Bob. Non, je n'ai pas de doute de ça. Oui, ça c'est lui. Ça c'est lui. Son cheveu, son visage, ses mouvements. C'est vraiment Bob.
Arriving in the heat of the action, with the French being thoroughly routed by the Vietnamese, he felt those old familiar emotions. Could this then be a new beginning? Plunging through the paddy fields, he seemed galvanized to the other journalists. Oblivious of the shells raining down all around him, he photographed his fifth and last war as if he was indestructible. When they found Capa, who'd wandered away from the group of soldiers he was accompanying, he was lying on his back, in a pool of blood, with a serious chest wound, and his left leg in shreds. Next to him was the crater left by the mine he had trodden on. His left hand was still clutching his camera. Discussing the landing at Omaha Beach, Capa had written, "The war reporter is free to place his bet, in other words, his life, on whichever horse he chooses. He can also pull out at the last moment. I am a gambler. I decided to go for it."